There is a 30-minute phone call buried in these court documents that explains almost everything about this case. It was a normal vetting call, nothing secret, nothing unusual, and yet the moment questions turned to that call, everything blew up. Sanctions were demanded, objections became headlines, and suddenly the process itself was treated like a threat. That reaction is the story. Because here is what people keep missing. For the most part, the public already has a pretty solid sense of who they think is right in this case. That is not speculation. There is a TMZ poll tied to this situation, and the results are not subtle. People have seen the filings, the clips, the behavior. An opinion has formed. And the reason that matters is not because polls decide court cases. It matters because everyone involved knows the public has turned. Once perception hardens like that, behavior changes. You stop arguing facts and start managing damage. That is where this case is now. People are not watching to see who wins. They are watching to see who can sit still when the spotlight is no longer flattering. Because once the positions are locked and the facts are on the record, this stops being about persuasion. It becomes a pressure test. Can you tolerate resistance without escalating it? Can you let a process move forward without narrating every emotional beat? Can you accept that not every moment goes your way? That is where this case shifted. Not legally, behaviorally. And the documents make that clear in a way no press release ever could. At the center of this is an expert named Nicole Alexander. Her role was straightforward, and this part matters. She was hired to analyze whether the backlash Blake experienced online was the result of a coordinated smear campaign or whether it was organic public response mixed with normal media cycles. That distinction is everything. If the backlash was organic, Blake's core narrative weakens. If it was manipulated, her framing holds. So this expert was not some side character. She was a structural risk. Which is why the deposition mattered. During that deposition, the expert testified to something extremely routine. Before she was hired, she had a 30-minute call in August as part of a vetting process. She was not retained yet. She was one of several people being considered. She described it exactly the way anyone in her position would. Normal. Boring. Industry standard. Which is precisely why what happened next raised eyebrows. The moment Blake's lawyers began drifting from the expert's analysis into how she was recruited, the defense drew a narrow boundary. They instructed the witness not to answer questions that moved away from methodology and toward motive, citing privilege in a limited and consistent way. That is a routine move in expert depositions. What was not routine was the reaction. Instead of noting the objection and moving on, Blake's team treated that boundary like a crisis. A standard limitation suddenly became evidence of misconduct. A normal privilege line turned into the centerpiece of a sanctions motion. That is where things stopped looking procedural and started revealing who was uncomfortable with losing control of the narrative. To anyone watching without a law degree, a different set of questions comes up. Why was Blake so focused on how the expert was recruited instead of what the expert actually concluded? Why did motive suddenly matter more than methodology? And why did a routine objection trigger such an outsized response? This is where the pattern sharpens. Blake's side is not reacting to legal danger. They are reacting to narrative discomfort. Every time something happens that they cannot fully control, the response is not patience, it is intervention. A deposition gets tense, which is normal. Instead of moving on, it becomes a crisis. An expert does not affirm the preferred storyline. Instead of rebutting the substance later, the questioning itself becomes the problem. A routine procedural moment happens. Suddenly, it is framed like a moral emergency that needs immediate court attention. That is not confidence. That is intolerance for uncertainty. Now contrast that with the other side. Baldoni's side is boring, painfully boring. And that is exactly why it is working, because in an industry addicted to chaos, the people who do not demand constant emotional management quietly become the safest option in the room. They show up. They answer the questions. They let the record build, even when it is uncomfortable. They do not ask the judge to referee feelings. They do not pause proceedings to litigate tone. They do not treat every moment of friction like a personal affront. They let things be dull. Blake's side, meanwhile, cannot stop explaining itself. Every pushback needs framing. Every discomfort needs context. Every unanswered question feels like something that must be corrected immediately. At a certain point, it stops reading as advocacy and starts reading as self-soothing. And this is where the defense response quietly lands its hardest blow. They point out that Blake's team sat through a 7-hour deposition, allowed the questioning to finish, did not seek real-time court relief, and only afterward filed a sanctions motion based on selected excerpts. That timing matters. Because it tells you, this was not about fairness in the moment. It was about optics after the fact. In other words, the issue was not what happened. It was how it might look. Which is why the defense openly accuses Blake's side of filing the motion to generate headlines. That is not a casual accusation. That is a deliberate one. Zoom out, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This case is not just being litigated in court. It is being managed emotionally. The expert was not there to comfort anyone. She was not there to validate a narrative. She was there to analyze data. And when that analysis did not cooperate, control became the priority. That is why the recruitment questions mattered so much. Because once you start asking how experts are chosen, you start implying bias. And once you imply bias, you can avoid dealing with conclusions. That is a familiar move. And it leads straight into the irony that keeps repeating. The side arguing that public perception was unfairly shaped outside the courtroom cannot tolerate perception behaving independently inside it. Questions become off-limits. Discomfort becomes misconduct. Confusion becomes sanctionable. That is not about protecting the process. That is about protecting the story. Judges do not exist for that. They exist to decide whether the process itself is broken. Here, the judge looked at the record and said it was not, and told everyone to move on. That was not dismissal. That was a boundary. And boundaries tend to frustrate people who are used to steering the narrative at all times. So, when people ask why this case feels like it keeps dragging, the answer is not legal. It is behavioral. One side is willing to sit in discomfort and let time and transcripts do the work. The other keeps interrupting to explain why the experience feels unfair. That is why this case does not feel explosive. It feels exhausting. And exhaustion is the one thing Hollywood avoids more than controversy. So no, this is not about who objected louder. It is about what this case is quietly revealing. When your story is strong, you let it stand. When it is fragile, you hover. Baldoni's team is letting the record speak, even when it is not flattering. Blake's team keeps stepping in to manage perception, moment by moment, question by question. This case did not invent that behavior. It just took something people had quietly noticed and made it impossible to look past.
That's my opinion!